Section 1. The Golden Lions. Who were the Lannisters? There is a saying in Westeros that has outlasted kings, wars, and entire dynasties. It passed between merchants on the Gold Road, whispered in the taverns of King's Landing, carved quietly into the cautious thinking of every lord who ever dared consider crossing the family that sat behind it. The saying is this: a Lannister always pays his debts. Simple words. 6 words, really. And yet woven into those 6 words is a history so layered and so violent and so extraordinary that it spans something close to 6,000 years, stretching from the ancient volcanic crags of the Westerlands all the way to the molten remains of a great iron seat in a shattered city beside the sea. Tonight, we are going to travel through all of it, slowly, quietly. Every chapter of one of the most remarkable dynasties that the world of Westeros ever produced, told in a way that lets you drift off gradually into the kind of sleep that feels earned, the kind that comes when your mind has been somewhere truly interesting and is finally ready to rest. So, settle in. Let your breathing slow a little. You do not have to hold on to every word. The story will carry itself. It has done so for 6 millennia, and it can carry you gently into the dark as well. The Lannisters, the Golden Lions, the richest family in the known world, the lords of the West, the people who turned cunning into currency and gold into power, and power into something very close to permanence. In the universe George R.R. Martin built, with all its northern ice and its dragon fire, and its complicated wars and its complicated people, House Lannister stands as perhaps the most distinctly human of all the great families. They were not magical, not prophetic, not touched by gods or ancient pacts or supernatural destinies in any clear way. What they had was simpler, and in some ways far more terrifying. They had intelligence, they had ambition, they had gold, and they had an absolute cold-blooded willingness to do whatever those 3 things demanded of them. The family seat was Casterly Rock, and it is worth pausing for just a moment to let the image of that place settle over you like a warm weight. Casterly Rock sat on the western coast of Westeros, perched on an enormous cliff overlooking the Sunset Sea. Not built on a cliff precisely, but carved into one, grown out of one, become one over so many centuries that the stone in the castle had become the same thing entirely. The rock was, by any measure, one of the most impressive structures in the known world, rising 3 times the height of the wall in the north, its sea-carved caverns booming with the sound of waves far below, its upper chambers and towers catching the salt wind off the water, its depths honeycombed with mine shafts and galleries and tunnels that went down so far they reached into geological darkness that no natural light had touched in thousands of years. And in those depths was gold, so much gold that travelers from as far as distant Asshai, halfway around the known world, had heard the stories and still found them hard to believe. Merchants from Yi-Ti, the Eastern Empire across the Jade Sea, asked travelers whether it was really true that the Lord of the Rock lived in a palace of solid gold, whether farmers in the Westerlands actually did collect nuggets by plowing their fields. The reputation of Casterly Rock's wealth was not an exaggeration built up by proud descendants. It was something so extreme and so consistent across thousands of years that it had become one of those facts that does not require defending. The Lannisters were rich, incalculably rich. Generationally, historically, foundationally rich. And that wealth, pooled in the base of their mountain home for millennium after millennium, was both the story of how they rose to dominate Westeros and, in the very end, a quiet clue to how they fell. But we are getting far ahead of ourselves. The Lannisters at their peak, in the era when their faces filled the court of King's Landing and their name was synonymous with power itself, that version of the family is a destination, not a starting point. To understand them properly, to feel the full weight of what they became, we have to go back much further. Back past the wars and the betrayals and the golden hair and the whispered incest and the brilliant cruelty of the man who made them truly fearsome. We have to go back past written history entirely, back to the age before records, the age before kings in any formal sense, the age when the world was still being sorted out and the great families of Westeros were just beginning to dream of permanence. We have to go back to the age of heroes. We have to go back to a man called Lan the Clever. But before we do, I want to take a breath with you here. I want you to picture Casterly Rock as it might have looked from the sea. Imagine a ship moving slowly along the western coast on a late afternoon, the sun turning everything amber and copper, the cliffs dropping straight into the water below, and there, rising above the rocky shoreline, something that looks less like a building than a geological event. A mountain with windows. A mountain that had been lived in for so long it had begun to resemble its inhabitants, proud and golden and utterly certain of its own permanence. That image, a place that felt eternal, that was the dream the Lannisters were always reaching toward. Eternal wealth, eternal power, eternal relevance. And for a very, very long time, they came closer to achieving it than almost any family in all of Westeros ever managed. Now, let your eyes relax a little. Let the weight of the day start to loosen from your shoulders. The story is just beginning, and there is no hurry. There is nowhere else you need to be tonight except here, drifting slowly through one of history's great dynasties, from its mythological roots all the way to its golden and terrible flowering. If you are enjoying where this is going, and you want to stay connected to more stories like this one, consider leaving a comment below telling us the time and place you are listening from. It is something genuinely wonderful, knowing that someone in the quiet of their room at midnight somewhere across the world is sharing this same slow drift through history. And if you subscribe, you will always have another story waiting for you when this one ends. Section 2. Lan the Clever. A trickster at the dawn of the world. The Age of Heroes is what historians and meisters in Westeros call the period after the Long Night, after the last of the great primordial conflicts that had shaped the world's earliest form, when the races and peoples and noble lines that would eventually become the familiar houses of Westeros were still forming, still figuring out who they were. It is an era of giants in the cultural memory of the continent. Bran the Builder raised the wall in the north and founded House Stark. The Grey King ruled the Iron Islands and was said to have taken a mermaid for a wife and slain a sea dragon. Torrhen Godsgrief built his castle on the Stormlands coast in defiance of the sea gods themselves. And somewhere in that golden, legendary chaos of world-making, there was Lan. No one knows exactly where he came from. That ambiguity is, in some ways, the most appropriate thing about him, because his descendants would always be the sort of people who made their origins deliberately difficult to pin down. Some legends say he was a bastard grandchild of Garth Greenhand, the mythological patriarch whose bloodline supposedly spread through half the noble houses of the Reach. Other stories say Lan was an Andal adventurer who had crossed the narrow sea from Essos thousands of years before the Andal invasion would eventually reshape Westeros. Still other tales say he was of the First Men, the original inhabitants of the continent, distinguished from his neighbors only by that impossible golden hair that the songs always mention, hair that was lighter than anything the dark-maned First Men typically produced, which is why one version of his legend simply says he stole his golden color from the sun itself. What all the legends agree on is this: he was clever. Extraordinarily, dangerously, almost supernaturally clever. And at some point in the Age of Heroes, this clever golden-haired man turned his attention to a vast, cliff-mounted fortress on the western coast of Westeros. A fortress that sat above the richest gold deposits in the known world, and which belonged, at that time, to a family called the Casterlys. The Casterlys were an old family, one of the ancient rulers of the western region, during the Dawn Age that preceded even the Age of Heroes. Their founding legend, far less celebrated than the one about Lan, involved a huntsman named Corlos, son of Castor, who had tracked a lion terrorizing his village into a cave. He killed the lion, but spared its cubs, and was supposedly rewarded by the gods with a shaft of light, revealing a vein of gold in the cave wall. That cave became Casterly Rock. The gold became the foundation of everything, and for however long the Age of Heroes lasted, the Casterlys sat on their mountain of Shorl and looked out across the sunset sea, and felt reasonably secure about their position in the world. Then, Lan found the cleft. In the most widely told version of the story, Lan discovered a secret, narrow passage into the rock, a crack in the stone too small for a normal person to squeeze through comfortably, entirely invisible from outside, the kind of accident of geology that would pass unnoticed for decades, unless you were looking for exactly that sort of thing. And Lan, being who he was always looking for exactly that sort of thing. The story says that he stripped himself naked, covered his body in butter until his skin was slick as a seal, and pushed himself through that impossible crack in the stone. And then, alone in the belly of the most impregnable fortress in the Western world, he went to work. He whispered to the sleeping Casterlys in the dark. He howled from the shadows like something inhuman. He crept between chambers in the night and took treasures from one person's room and placed them in another's. He rigged traps. He planted doubts and fear and suspicion with the careful precision of a gardener who is very patient about his harvest. And slowly, methodically, he made the Casterlys believe that their home was haunted by something that wanted them gone. There are other versions. In one, he filled the fortress with mice and rats and vermin until the stench and the chaos drove the family out. In another, he smuggled lions into the rock and let them loose. In the most pragmatic and arguably most believable version, stripped of all the drama, Lan was simply a man-at-arms or a household servant who managed to impregnate a Casterly daughter. And when the Lord of the Rock died with no male heirs, the inheritance passed through the girl he had fathered children with. And Lan simply became the new lord through the quiet and entirely legal mechanism of succession. Tyrion Lannister, centuries later, reportedly preferred a version in which Lan had fathered so many children with so many Casterly girls that the family was simply forced to accept his rule out of exhaustion. It is a story that sounds exactly like the kind of thing Tyrion would find both funny and philosophically satisfying. Whatever the method, the result was always the same. The Casterlys vanished from the chronicles. They do not appear in any reliable record after a certain point in the Age of Heroes. They simply cease. And in their place, appearing from apparently nowhere, ruling Casterly Rock and commanding the wealth of the Western Hills, was the previously unheard-of family called the Lannisters. There is something quietly extraordinary about that founding myth when you sit with it for a moment. Consider what it says about the family. Most of the great houses of Westeros trace their origins to some act of dramatic, physical heroism. Bran the Builder raised an impossible wall. Torrhen, God's grief, defied gods. The Grey King slew a sea monster. But the founding myth of House Lannister is a story about a man who won everything he wanted through patience, deception, and an almost preternatural ability to identify and exploit weakness in someone else's position. The Lannisters didn't win Casterly Rock with a sword. They won it with a mind. And 6,000 years later, that quality, that dangerous strategic intelligence, that willingness to find the hidden crack in someone else's fortress and squeeze through it, wearing nothing but cleverness, would still be the most recognizable thing about them. You can see it in Tywin's cold calculations. You can see it in Cersei's constant maneuvering. You can see it most clearly, perhaps, in Tyrion, who never had a sword worth trusting, but had a mind that could cut through walls. Lan the Clever left no written record. He left no direct quotes, no verified deeds, no graves that anyone has positively identified. What he left was a family, and a family name, and a mountain full of gold, and a way of thinking about power that would echo through every generation that came after him. The legend says his ghost still walks the halls of Casterly Rock sometimes, and that the fortress has never fallen to an enemy in all the millennia since he first slipped through that crack in the stone. Whether that is because of the rock's genuinely formidable natural defenses, or because of some quality Lan passed down into the stone along with his bloodline, depends entirely on how much you believe in the persistence of a clever man's will. Let that settle over you now. The idea of a trickster at the beginning of history, slipping through the dark, whispering in people's ears. There is something almost somnambulant about that image. The fortress quiet, the occupants dreaming, and somewhere in the shadows, someone patient enough to wait and clever enough to win. Section 3. Kings of the Rock. The Rise of a Dynasty. Somewhere between the mythological end of Lan the Clever's story and the beginning of the period where actual historical records start to exist in any reliable form, the family he founded went from being the mysterious new occupants of a famous rock to being kings. Not lords, not chieftains, not simply powerful families among other powerful families. Kings. The Kings of the Rock, as the title ran, lords of the Westerlands and everything in it. The first historically recognized King of the Rock was a man named Lorien I, though some accounts give that title posthumously to Lan himself. Lorien is significant for a couple of reasons. He expanded Lannister power significantly, gaining the fealty of other Western houses, including House Rain, a name that will return to this story much later in circumstances that are considerably darker. He also defeated a mysterious figure known as the Hooded King, Morgan Bonfort, in some conflict that the records do not describe in enough detail to fully reconstruct. What the records suggest is that by Lorient's time, the Lannisters were not merely occupying Casterly Rock. They were building a kingdom around it. The wealth from the mines drove this expansion in ways that are easy to underestimate if you are used to thinking about medieval power primarily in military terms. Gold was not just a way to buy soldiers, though the Lannisters always had plenty of those. Gold was what allowed you to be in two places at once. It allowed you to hire someone else to do dangerous work while you concentrated on something more strategically important. It allowed you to build roads, fund harvests, absorb bad years without the kind of desperate despair that broke lesser houses. The gold of Casterly Rock gave House Lannister a kind of institutional resilience that most families could not replicate, because most families' power was contingent on everything going right. The Lannisters' power was resilient to things going wrong. That is a qualitatively different kind of strength. As the centuries turned and the Age of Heroes faded into what historians called the Dawn Age, and then into the more recognizable pre-conquest era, the Lannisters kept their grip on the West through a combination of that financial resilience, genuine military capacity, and a political instinct that seemed to run in the blood. They were not the most aggressive kings in Westeros's history. They did not spend their reigns on constant conquest or endless expansion. They consolidated. They absorbed. They waited for the right moment. The Andal invasion changed everything for the Westerlands, as it changed everything for most of Westeros. The Andalas were a people from across the Narrow Sea, originally from the hills of Essos, who brought iron weapons, the faith of the Seven, and a culture that was in many ways more sophisticated than what the first men had developed in Westeros. In the eastern parts of the continent, particularly in the Vale of Arryn, the Andal invasion was bloody and protracted, a genuine conquest with massacres and decades of brutal warfare. But the Westerlands were different. By the time the Andal tide reached the western coast, its most violent edge had blunted against the kingdoms it had already passed through. What the Lannister kings of that era faced was not so much a military invasion as an unstoppable cultural migration, and they were wise enough to recognize the difference. Instead of fighting a war they might lose, they made accommodations. They invited Andal lords and knights to serve at Casterly Rock as wards and fosterlings, intermarrying their families gradually with the newcomers, absorbing Andal blood and Andal customs and the Andal faith into the Lannister line, rather than dying on a battlefield, defending a purity that was already a fading dream. This adaptability was not weakness. It was survival strategy of the highest order, and it worked. When the older First Men kingdoms that had fought the Andals were broken and replaced, House Lannister stood largely intact, now infused with Andal blood and Andal culture, but still recognizably itself, still the rulers of the Rock, still sitting on the gold. The great transition that destroyed other dynasties became, for the Lannisters, just another negotiation that they handled without losing the important parts. The eventual result of all that intermarriage and absorption was a Lannister line that was technically Andal in culture and religion, worshipping the Seven as good Andal people did, speaking the common tongue and practicing the faith and observing the customs that the Andal migration had spread across most of Westeros. But through the female line, they maintained their claim to descent from Lan himself, from that First Men trickster at the dawn of everything. It was, in retrospect, a brilliantly constructed identity. They were new enough to fit comfortably into the post-Andal world, and old enough to claim legitimacy that went back to the very foundation of civilization in the West. By the time of the event that would eventually end their status as independent kings, the Lannisters had been ruling the Westerlands for something approaching 5,000 or 6,000 years. Their hold on Casterly Rock had outlasted multiple waves of invasion, political upheaval, foreign cultural transformation, and the rise and fall of every other significant power in their region. They had survived not through constant military victory, but through something harder and less celebrated: continuity, adaptability, and the quiet persistence of an institution that never quite gave its enemies the opening they needed to finish it off. Lannisport, the city that had grown up beneath the shadow of Casterly Rock over many of those centuries, had become one of the largest and wealthiest cities in the known world. Lesser branches of the family had left the Rock over the generations to found their own households within the city, creating a diffuse network of Lannister blood and Lannister interest that spread through the commercial and civic life of the West without anyone quite being able to map its full extent. The gold that flowed from the mines beneath the Rock had turned the entire region into something close to a commercial empire, with merchants and craftsmen and sailors from across Essos and Westeros passing through Lannisport's harbor, leaving some of their wealth behind each time. This was the world the Lannisters ruled when Aegon Targaryen sailed from Dragonstone with his 2 sisters and his 3 dragons and announced, with polite but absolutely unambiguous certainty, that the age of separate kingdoms in Westeros was over. It was time for the Lions of the Rock to decide how they were going to handle a new kind of problem. Section 4. The Field of Fire. The Last King of the Rock. Aegon Targaryen did not conquer Westeros because he was the most politically brilliant man who ever lived, though he was formidable in that respect. He did not conquer it because he had the largest army, because by the standards of what he was attempting, his forces were actually quite modest. He conquered it because he had dragons, 3 of them. And in the history of warfare up to that point, no one had ever had to think seriously about what you could possibly do against an enemy who could simply set fire to everything you valued from several hundred feet above your head. Most of the kings of Westeros grasped this reality relatively quickly. The kingdoms fell in sequence as Aegon moved through the continent, some after brief resistance, some with almost none. But when he came to the Westerlands and the Reach, he found something different. 2 kings who had decided, against all evidence and all sense, that the thing to do was combine their forces and meet Aegon in the field with the largest army that had yet been assembled against him. King Loren I, Lannister of the Rock, and King Mern IX of House Gardener of the Reach were not stupid men. They understood the nature of the threat, but they also understood military math in the way that experienced commanders do, and the math seemed, on the surface, to favor them. Their combined force numbered somewhere around 55,000 men. Aegon had roughly 10,000. From any conventional military perspective, this was not a battle the alliance should be able to lose. What they had not fully accounted for, or perhaps had convinced themselves they could manage, was that all 3 of Aegon's dragons were going to be in the sky at the same time. The battle that resulted took place in the open lands of the Reach, in a field that would afterward be known, for very obvious reasons, as the Field of Fire. The 2 armies arranged themselves and advanced in the way armies had been advancing against each other since the dawn of organized violence, with wings and centers and flanking maneuvers and all the geometric choreography of traditional warfare. And then Aegon and his sisters Visenya and Rhaenys released their dragons, all 3 of them, together, for the only time during the entire conquest. Balerion the Black Dread, Aegon's dragon, was by this point a creature of enormous age and size, capable of swallowing a mammoth whole. Vhagar and Meraxes, his sister's mounts, were somewhat smaller but still ancient and terrible by any standard that existed before that moment. Together they swept over the combined army of the Reach and the Westerlands, and they set the field on fire, in a way that the name has never fully captured, because the name makes it sound like a dramatic moment, and what it actually was an apocalypse in miniature. More than 4,000 men burned, not died in battle, not fell to swords, burned. The fire traveled through the formation faster than men could run. The smoke was dense enough to choke those who were not yet burning. King Mern IX of House Gardener died in the flames, and every one of his heirs died with him, extinguishing the Gardener line completely, and ending their kingdom in the same afternoon it had raised its banners for what it hoped would be its greatest victory. Loren Lannister survived. He led the retreat of the Western forces, doing what kings do when a battle is manifestly, catastrophically lost, which is to preserve what can be preserved and accept the arithmetic that now exists. He was captured the following day. And here is where the Lannister political instinct, that same instinct Lan the Clever had shown at the very foundation of the family, showed itself again in a completely different generation and a completely different set of circumstances. Loren did not attempt to negotiate from a position of invented strength. He did not bluster or bargain or make claims about the difficulty of conquering Casterly Rock that might provoke Aegon into demonstrating exactly how wrong those claims were. He simply bent the knee. He submitted, fully and without conditions, and in so doing he made himself useful to the conqueror rather than an obstacle. Aegon, who understood power as well as anyone alive at that point, rewarded this wisdom appropriately. Loren was allowed to remain at Casterly Rock. His lands were returned to him. His family's position in the Westerlands was confirmed. He was elevated to the new title of Warden of the West, the first holder of that office, overseeing the Western region as Aegon's representative rather than as an independent king. The title change was profound, from king to lord, from sovereign to vassal, but the gold remained, the rock remained, the family remained intact. And Visenya Targaryen reportedly observed afterward that she was grateful Loren had come to meet them in the field, rather than retreating to Casterly Rock, because she was genuinely uncertain that even dragonfire could have brought those walls down. Whether she was right or not, we will never know. But the observation tells you something important about both parties. The Targaryens were formidable, yes, but the Lannisters were not conquered exactly. They were folded in, absorbed, continuing the same fundamental pattern they had been practicing since the Andal invasion. The kings of the Rock were gone, but the Lannisters were still there. Section 5. Under the Dragon Kings. Centuries of careful maneuvering. The first century after Aegon's conquest was not a particularly glamorous time for House Lannister. They kept their wealth, kept their seat, kept their position as Lords of the West. But in the new power structure that Aegon and his successors were building, with its small council and its Hand of the King and its network of political relationships centered on King's Landing, the Lannisters were conspicuously absent from the inner circle. The houses with the closest political connections to the early Targaryen kings were the Velaryons, who had been Valyrian allies for generations, and the Arryns, the Tullys, the Baratheons, and the Hightowers of Old Town. These were the families who filled the council seats and married into the royal family and built the relationships that carried influence in the New World. The Lannisters sat in the West with their gold and their rock and their relative autonomy, valued as a source of wealth and military strength, but not yet integrated into the centers of Targaryen power in any meaningful way. This began to shift gradually over the following century, through a combination of circumstance, strategic maneuvering, and the particular chaos of the Targaryen civil wars that punctuated the dynasty's history. The Faith Militant Uprising, which began in 42 AC when the religious order known as the Warriors' Sons and the Poor Fellows rose in violent resistance to what they considered the Targaryen dynasty's sinful customs, including its tradition of incestuous marriages, gave the Lannisters their first real opportunity to build credit with the crown. Lord Lyman Lannister, who held the Rock during this period, was a careful and strategic man who resented his house's distance from power, but was too sensible to attempt anything dramatic about it. When Prince Aegon Targaryen and his sister wife Rhaena were trapped at Craighall during the Faith Militant troubles, Lyman offered them refuge at Casterly Rock. This was simultaneously an act of genuine hospitality and a calculated political investment, providing shelter to a potential future king while maintaining enough plausible distance that if things went badly wrong, Lyman could argue he had simply been welcoming guests. When young Aegon eventually raised his banner against his uncle King Maegor the Cruel, Lyman could not openly commit to a side, the risks being too uncertain. But he allowed his bastard son, Sir Tyler Hill, to lead 500 men from Lannisport to join Aegon's forces, giving him the ability to deny having officially ordered anything, while still placing Lannister resources on what turned out to be the right side of the conflict. Aegon died fighting Maegor in any case, and it was Aegon's brother Jaehaerys who eventually ended Maegor's brutal reign and took the throne. But the principle established by Lyman's careful play, that the Lannisters could be valuable allies who provided real support while maintaining the deniability to survive if things went wrong, was one that their descendants would refine to a very sophisticated art form over the following centuries. The event known as the Dance of the Dragons, which occurred roughly a century and a half after the conquest, was another crucible that defined where the Lannisters stood in the political order. The dance was the Targaryen civil war between the factions supporting King Viserys I's daughter Rhaenyra, who had been named his heir, and those supporting his son Aegon II, whose claim his supporters argued superseded his half-sisters. It was, in essence, a war over succession and legitimacy that consumed the Targaryen family and much of the realm with it. The Lannisters at this point were represented most significantly by two brothers, Lord Jason Lannister, who initially marched in support of Rhaenyra's claim, and his twin Sir Tyland Lannister, who took the opposite view and supported Aegon II. This division was not a family catastrophe, but rather, whether by design or fortune, another hedge. One Lannister on each side meant that whichever faction won, a Lannister would have been loyal to the victor. Tyland, who was serving on the small council as master of ships under Viserys, moved decisively when the conflict began, seizing control of the royal treasury and securing funds for Aegon's cause. He was later captured by Rhaenyra's forces and tortured extensively for information about where the treasury assets had been hidden. The accounts say he refused to give up the information under prolonged and extreme duress, a different kind of Lannister quality showing itself. Not cleverness in this case, but a bone-deep stubbornness about the things that mattered most. Lord Jason, commanding the Western forces in the field, was killed in the Battle of the Red Fork, one of the major engagements of the war. His death was a genuine blow to the family in the short term, leaving a power vacuum in the management of Westerland's forces that created difficulties for the Western campaign. But the family survived, as it always had. The dance ended with significant cost to the Targaryen line, multiple dragons dead, the dynasty's power permanently diminished, and the political landscape of Westeros subtly but importantly rearranged. Through all of it, through the wars and the sieges and the burning and the political chaos, Casterly Rock stood. The gold kept flowing from the mines. The Lannister name kept its weight. And so the centuries continued, each generation of Lannisters navigating the particular challenges of their era with varying degrees of skill, sometimes drawing closer to the centers of power and sometimes retreating back to the west. There were Lannisters who served well and Lannisters who stumbled. There were periods of genuine influence and periods of relative quiet. Through it all, the family's fundamental position remained unchanged. They were rich. They were resilient. They were still there. Section 6, Tytos Lannister, the laughing lion who wept. Now we arrive at one of the most important pivots in the entire Lannister story, a moment that, in retrospect, made everything that followed possible. And it begins not with a great victory, not with a battle or a political triumph, but with a failure. A deep, embarrassing, generational failure that almost undid everything Lan the Clever had built. In the years before Aerys Targaryen took the Iron Throne, in that quiet pre-war period when Westeros was settling into the rhythms of a stable monarchy and the great houses were mostly concerned with their own internal politics, House Lannister was governed by a man named Tytos. Tytos Lannister was not evil. He was not stupid. He was not even in any obvious moral sense a bad man. He was something in some ways worse than any of those things for the purposes of ruling a powerful family in a dangerous world. He was kind. Genuinely, impractically, unwisely kind. He laughed too easily, and he forgave too readily, and he lent gold to vassals who had no intention of repaying it, and then lent them more when they came back with another story and another excuse. And he smiled at people who should have been making them afraid. The lords of the Westerlands looked at Tytos and saw something that had never been allowed to exist in living memory at Casterly Rock. They saw weakness. And with the slow, testing patience of people who understand that weakness is only valuable if you can exploit it carefully, they began to take advantage. House Rayne of Castamere was the most egregious example. The Raynes were old, proud, and wealthy in their own right, their own minds at Castamere having made them, at certain points, the second richest family in all of Westeros. Their sigil was a red lion, a deliberate echo of the Lannister golden lion, and that symbolic statement was not accidental. The Raynes saw themselves as Lannister peers, perhaps Lannister equals, and under the forgiving reign of Tytos, they began to act accordingly. They borrowed gold from the Lannisters on terms that were never really enforced. They expanded their own forces using those borrowed funds. They challenged Lannister decisions with open mockery. Lord Roger Rayne, called the Red Lion of Castamere, reportedly laughed aloud when letters arrived from Casterly Rock demanding repayment of debts, not responded with a counter-argument, not apologized and asked for more time, laughed. He sent the ravens back unanswered. Alongside the Rains, House Tarbeck of Tarbeck Hall was engaged in similar behavior, emboldened by the same reading of Tytos's character. Lady Ellen Tarbeck, born a Rain herself, was particularly aggressive in pressing the family's advantages. She had previously made various ambitious maneuvers around Casterly Rock during an earlier period, having been betrothed to one Lannister heir who died, then seeking comfort with his twin, and generally behaving with a confidence that suggested she believed the normal rules did not quite apply to her. Tytos, confronted with the escalating insolence of his vassals, did the thing that came naturally to him, which was to do nothing that could not be undone, to avoid the confrontation, to hope that patience and generosity might eventually bring these relationships back to a functional place. When Tylan Tarbeck was finally seized and imprisoned at Casterly Rock after an egregious act of defiance, Lady Ellen responded by taking 3 Lannisters hostage herself and threatening to harm them unless her husband was released unharmed, and Tytos released him, with an apology. He also forgave the Tarbeck debts entirely as a gesture of goodwill. The lesson was heard very clearly throughout the Westerlands. The Lion of the Rock could be defied, could be mocked, could be taken hostage, effectively, through the threat of harm to distant relatives, and would respond with forgiveness and apologies rather than blood. But Tytos had a son who had been watching all of this from the time he was old enough to understand what he was seeing, and who was forming conclusions about power and weakness and what it cost a family to be perceived as soft in a world that had no mercy for softness. That son's name was Tywin, and everything we have told you so far, everything about Lan the Clever and the Field of Fire, and the Dance of the Dragons, and all those centuries of Lannister patience and adaptability, it was all leading here, to this moment, to this son, to what happened when someone with Lan the Clever's fundamental nature but none of Lan's lightness, someone harder and colder and absolutely without sentimentality, inherited a family that had been humiliated and decided to fix it. Let that weight settle over you for a moment. Feel the quietness of it, the way certain moments in history gather themselves before they break. Section 7. The Reigns of Castamere, Tywin's Reckoning. Tywin Lannister grew up watching his father be laughed at, not once, not occasionally, but as a recurring feature of his childhood. He watched the Lords of the West bring their requests to Casterly Rock and leave with more than they had asked for, having paid nothing for the privilege. He watched his father's easy laughter, while the family name became something that people associated with generosity to the point of foolishness. In a world where the perception of strength was itself a form of power, and the perception of weakness was an invitation, this was not merely embarrassing, it was existential. Tywin left for the War of the Ninepenny Kings, a campaign on the Stepstones against a collection of sellswords and adventurers who had taken the name of Blackfyre and renewed old claims to the Iron Throne. He was a young man when he went, a knight, newly made, with his father's gold and his family's name, and nothing yet of his own legend. He served with distinction. He returned home with a clear-eyed assessment of what the realm thought of his family and an equally clear sense of what he was going to do about it. His first act was to demand repayment of all the outstanding debts the Lannister treasury was owed throughout the Westerlands, not to request it, to demand it. And for those who could not pay in gold, he demanded hostages, the ancient practice of securing compliance through the threat of harm to someone's family. Roger Rayne, the Red Lion, received this demand and laughed, as his father would have expected him to, as everyone who had known Tytos's court expected. The ravens flew back to Casterly Rock, with Ron's laughter effectively written into their silence. Lord Walderan Tarbeck did something more brazen still. He rode to Casterly Rock in person, presumably to persuade Lord Tytos to overrule his difficult son and restore the comfortable arrangements they had all enjoyed under the old regime. He did not find Lord Tytos at the gates. He found Tywin, and Tywin had him arrested and thrown in the dungeon. When Lady Ellen Tarbeck responded by capturing 3 Lannisters as hostages, 2 of them distant relatives from Lannisport, and 1 a young squire named Stafford, who was Tywin's first cousin, Tywin's private recommendation to his father was that they should return Lord Walderan to his wife in 3 pieces. He was overruled. Tytos, still lord and still himself, released Walderan, apologized, and forgave the remaining Tarbeck debts. There was even a feast at Castamere afterward to celebrate the end of hostilities, at which Titus and Roger Rayne proclaimed their eternal friendship. Tywin did not attend. He understood exactly what that feast meant, which was that the situation had not resolved. It had simply been deferred. His father had demonstrated one more time that the cost of defying House Lannister was a feast in your honor. The only question was when this arrangement would finally come to an end. In 261 AC, with Tywin back from the wars and the family situation deteriorating, he sent ravens to both Castamere and Tarbeck Hall, not asking, but summoning both houses to answer for their accumulated offenses against the Lannister name. He already knew what their answer would be. They rose in open rebellion, exactly as he had expected. Tywin moved immediately, without informing his father of what he was doing until it was already underway. He called the Lannister banners and rode out with approximately 500 knights, 3,000 men-at-arms, and 3,000 crossbowmen, a fast and purposeful force built for the kind of campaign he was planning rather than a slow siege army. His close allies, Houses Marbrand and Prester, joined him. He moved first toward Tarbeck Hall. Lady Ellen, when the Lannister host arrived at her gates, laughed at the herald Kevan Lannister who came under a flag of peace. She reportedly said that her brothers were also lions, with claws as sharp as his. She closed her gates and sent ravens to Castamere calling for Roger to bring his forces. Tywin had siege engines throw a single massive boulder over the walls. It hit Tarbeck Hall's aged keep and brought the whole structure down on top of Lady Ellen and her son Tion. All resistance ended in that moment. The castle was put to the torch. Ellen's daughters, if the accounts are accurate, were sent to join the Silent Sisters, a religious order that maintained a vow of silence and never left their convents. One of Ellen's young grandchildren reportedly disappeared during the fighting. Later accounts suggest he was thrown down a well by Sir Amory Lorch, one of Tywin's men, a detail so dark that some historians have questioned whether it could be accurate, and others have noted that it is entirely consistent with the campaign's logic. Tarbeck Hall burned for a day and a night, until nothing was left of it but black walls and ash. Roger Rayne arrived from Castamere with roughly 2,000 men, exhausted from a forced march, just in time to see what remained of his sister's seat. He launched a desperate attack and was driven back. Lannister numbers were overwhelming. As the Raynes retreated toward Castamere, Roger was hit by a crossbow bolt between his shoulders. He was feverish and barely functional when they finally reached the safety of the castle. What happened next is the core of the legend, what made the song inevitable. Sir Reynard Rayne, Roger's younger, and in many ways more capable brother, assumed command in Roger's stead. He looked at the situation clearly and recognized what Tywin had brought. He could not win a field battle. The castle on the surface was too exposed to fall back to. But Castamere, like Casterly Rock itself, had grown from a mine. Its tunnels went deep, wider, and more habitable than any attacker could easily fight through. He led all his people, men, women, and children, down into the mines of Castamere, approximately 300 people in total. He sealed the doors. And he sent terms to Tywin above. Reynard offered complete surrender. He would be a loyal vassal. All he asked was that Tywin accept hostages from the Rayne forces and allow the rest to live. Tywin read the terms. He sent no reply. Instead, he had his men seal the mine entrances. Pickaxes and shovels and tons of stone, blocking every opening, packing the earth down until there was no crack large enough for air to move through with any comfort. And when that was done, he found the small stream that fed the pool beside the castle, the pool from which Castamere took its name, and he dammed it. Then he diverted the water to the nearest mine entrance. The water found the gaps in the rubble easily enough. It trickled through the packed earth in a dozen thin streams. It began to fill the tunnels below. Lannister soldiers stationed at the furthest sealed entrances later reported that they could hear sounds coming from underground. Faint sounds, barely audible through tons of stone. By morning, there was silence. None of the 300 people in the mines of Castamere ever came out again. Tywin had the surface castle set on fire afterward, as he had done at Tarbeck Hall. By the time the flames died down, Castamere was ruins. House Rayne, which had dared to call itself the equal of the Golden Lion, no longer existed. Not weakened, not chastened, erased. A singer named Tom of Seven Streams wrote a song about it. The song asked a question from the Red Lion's perspective, and then answered it with the only answer that mattered. "And who are you?" the proud lord said. that I must bow so low? Only a cat of a different coat. That's all the truth I know. In a coat of gold or a coat of red, a lion still has claws. And mine are long and sharp, my lord, as long and sharp as yours. And so he spoke, and so he spoke, that lord of Castamere. But now the rains weep over his hall, with no one there to hear. The song was called The Rains of Castamere. It was a play on words, the rains falling over the ruins of the rains. And in the decades and centuries that followed, it became the most feared piece of music in Westeros. Not a war cry, not a triumphant march, just a quiet song, played softly, that reminded everyone who heard it of what happened to people who forgot that the lion still had claws. King Aerys Targaryen, the second of that name, heard what Tywin had done in the Westerlands and offered him the position of Hand of the King. Tywin accepted and served in that role for 20 years, the most influential non-royal figure in the realm during one of its most consequential periods. The soft years of Tytos Lannister were over. The era of Tywin had begun. Section 8, The King's Lair, Jaime, Cersei, and the Mad King's Fire. There is a generation that sits at the heart of the most famous Lannister stories, the generation that the world most commonly means when it says the name. 3 children born to Tywin and his wife Joanna, herself a Lannister of the Lannisport branch, a cousin who had been Tywin's companion since childhood and who died giving birth to the third and last of those children. 3 children who would each, in their own way, embody a different facet of everything the Lannisters had been building toward for 6,000 years. Cersei was the eldest, born first by mere minutes ahead of her twin brother Jaime, golden-haired and green-eyed and achingly aware from her earliest years of both the privileges and the frustrations of her position. She was a Lannister. She was brilliant, ambitious, perceptive, in the specific way that comes from watching powerful men make decisions you are not allowed to participate in, filing away everything for later use. But she was also a girl in a world that would not let her rule, daughter to a man who saw her primary value as a marriageable asset, a chip in the game of alliances, rather than an heir. Jaime was the golden son, genuinely beautiful, gifted with a sword beyond almost anyone of his generation, charming in the effortless way of people who have never been made to feel small. He became a knight young. He was everything the world wanted a Lannister heir to be. And then Aerys Targaryen, the Mad King, did something that redefined his life entirely. When Jaime was 15 years old, Aerys appointed him to the King's Guard. This looks, on the surface, like an honor. In reality, it was a calculated insult to Tywin, removing his only son and heir from the line of succession for Casterly Rock at a stroke. A King's Guard took no wife, held no lands, inherited nothing. By giving Jaime the White Cloak, Aerys had effectively stolen Tywin's legacy in the single most elegant way available to him. He had made it look like a compliment. Tywin had already been drifting into conflict with the increasingly erratic king. The tensions between the 2 most powerful men in the realm had been building for years as Aerys's behavior grew stranger and his paranoia deepened. When Jaime was named to the King's Guard, Tywin resigned as Hand of the King and withdrew to Casterly Rock, an act of enormous symbolic weight. He was the most capable administrator the realm had seen in a generation, and he simply left. Jaime stayed in King's Landing, bound by his vows, watching from close proximity as the man he had sworn to protect descended further and further into madness. Aerys Targaryen had not always been mad. People who had known him as a young man spoke of someone clever and charming, interested in art and engineering, the kind of king who had seemed, at his coronation, to promise a genuinely good reign. But somewhere along the way, sometime around his imprisonment and humiliation at the defiance of Duskendale, something in him had broken or twisted past the point of repair. He became obsessed with fire. He burned men for offenses real and imagined, small and large, and he watched them burn with what observers described as a kind of terrible satisfaction. He distrusted everyone, his hand, his lords, his wife. He kept pyromancers close, those practitioners of the rare art of producing wildfire, that alchemical substance that burned with green flames hot enough to melt stone, and that stuck to everything it touched like a living thing. He had them stockpile wildfire throughout King's Landing in vast quantities, hidden in cellars and drainage systems and forgotten chambers beneath the city streets. And as Robert Baratheon's rebellion tore apart the realm, and the Targaryen dynasty began its final, catastrophic unraveling, Aerys turned this obsession into a plan. If he could not hold King's Landing, he would burn it. He would burn the city, the 500,000 people living in it, the attacking forces surrounding it, the history and the buildings and the future, all of it, in a green fire that he seemed to believe would transform him into some kind of dragon-like figure of rebirth. He had given the order. He had the pyromancers ready. "Burn them all," he whispered, over and over, like a prayer for something that was not mercy. Jaime was in the throne room when the Lannister army arrived at King's Landing. Tywin had waited, with characteristic calculation, until the outcome of the war was no longer genuinely uncertain, and had then presented himself as a relieving force. The city gates opened to admit his troops, and Aerys believed until the last moment that his hand had returned to save him. The pyromancer Rossar was making for the tunnels when Jaime killed him. Then Jaime crossed the room to where Aerys stood and put his sword through the king's back. As Aerys fell, Jaime cut his throat, to be certain, and then he sat down on the Iron Throne and waited for whoever would come next. Ned Stark found him there, Jaime still in the white armor of the King's Guard, the Mad King's blood pooling across the floor, and judged him without asking a single question. Kingslayer, Oathbreaker, the man who had killed the king he was sworn to protect. What Ned Stark could not know, what no one knew because Jaime never bothered to explain himself, was that Aerys had given the order to burn 500,000 people that afternoon, that the pyromancers were already in position, that Jaime had killed Rossar and the others, and then Aerys himself, not to betray a vow, but because betraying the specific vow was the only way to honor the deeper obligation, the one that said you were supposed to protect the innocent, that you were supposed to be a knight in something more than just title. He had saved the city. He would carry the name Kingslayer for the rest of his life. Robert Baratheon became king, and Tywin Lannister, moving with the quiet precision that defined him, ensured that his daughter Cersei became queen. It was the arrangement Jon Arryn advised, and it was an arrangement that served Tywin perfectly. His gold had funded the new king's debts. His daughter sat on the throne beside the king. The Lannisters, who had been vassals since Aegon's conquest, were now, in every practical sense, the power behind the power. The debt had been paid. The game had been won, or so it appeared. Section 9. The War of the Five Kings. The lion at its peak. Let the night settle a little deeper around you now. We have traveled a long way through this story already, from the mythological morning of Lon the Clever's trickery to the cold political maneuvering of Tywin, from dragons in the sky to poison and politics in the corridors of power. The next part of the story is where everything comes to a head, where the 6,000 years of Lannister accumulation, their wealth and their cunning and their ruthlessness and their complicated family loyalties, all flowers at once into the most dramatic and consequential period in their history. The death of Robert Baratheon was not an accident. Robert was a man who had never been comfortable sitting on a throne, who preferred the memory of the war that won him power to the dull administrative reality of exercising it. He drank too much. He hunted too recklessly. And Cersei, who had despised him from approximately the night of their wedding, and who had been managing the quiet machinery of her own political survival for 17 years, arranged for his death in a way that left her hands perfectly clean. She arranged for his wine to be strong and his hunting companions to be inattentive, and a wild boar did the rest. What followed was the War of the Five Kings, the largest conflict Westeros had seen since Aegon's conquest, a sprawling, multi-front war that swept across the entire continent and consumed most of the major families in one way or another. At its heart, for the Lannisters, the question was simple and brutal. Cersei had placed her son Joffrey on the throne, presenting him to the realm as Robert's heir. The problem was that Joffrey was not Robert's son. None of Cersei's 3 children were. They had all been fathered by Jaime, in the incestuous relationship the twins had maintained for their entire adult lives, the secret that would eventually unravel everything. Ned Stark had discovered the truth from the same evidence that had led Jon Arryn to his death, the fact that every Baratheon in living memory had produced black-haired children, while every one of Cersei's was golden-haired. The math did not work. The secret was not as secure as the Lannisters had believed. Ned Stark, being Ned Stark, chose honor over survival. He confronted Cersei with what he knew. He gave her the chance to flee rather than arresting her immediately. In return for this gesture of mercy toward a woman who had none to offer him in return, he lost his head in the yard of the Sept of Baelor, executed on Joffrey's orders in a moment of sadistic improvisation that upended every deal that had been made and set the entire north ablaze with grief and rage. Robb Stark marched south with the Northern Army and won battle after battle, proving himself a more gifted military commander than anyone had expected from a boy of 16. He was devastating in the field, catching Lannister forces at the Whispering Wood and destroying Jaime's host, capturing Jaime as himself in the process. Tywin, who had marched his main army to Harrenhal and was watching the strategic situation with the measured attention of a man who had never in his adult life allowed emotion to dictate tactics, absorbed the losses and began looking for the angle that would turn the war. In King's Landing, Tyrion arrived as Tywin's appointed hand of the king, sent to manage the chaos that Cersei's political blunders and Joffrey's erratic cruelty had created. He came in with no great popularity and less sentimental attachment to the court politics that had calcified around the throne. He removed incompetent or compromised small council members, managed the city's limited resources with real skill, and prepared for the attack that he could see coming, with Stannis Baratheon's fleet and army bearing down on King's Landing from the sea. The Battle of the Blackwater was Tyrion's greatest moment, and it deserves to be described slowly because it is one of those events where the gap between how it is remembered and what it actually was is worth understanding. Stannis Baratheon came with 200 ships. His army outnumbered the city's defenders significantly. He had a genuine claim to the throne, perhaps the strongest legitimate claim of anyone in the conflict. And he had Melisandre's religious certainty behind him like a wind at his back. The city seemed likely to fall. Tyrion had been preparing for this for months. He had discovered that the alchemists possessed a vast stock of wildfire, the same substance Aerys had intended to use to destroy the city. He had them produce more of it, enormous quantities, and he had it loaded onto a single ship that was allowed to leak its cargo into the bay as Stannis' fleet entered the Blackwater Rush. He had an enormous chain raised across the mouth of the river once the fleet was committed, preventing retreat. And when the moment was right, he had a burning arrow fired into the leaking wildfire. What happened next was visible from much of King's Landing. The entire Blackwater Rush seemed to become something that was not quite water anymore. Green fire, the distinctive color of wildfire, spread across the river faster than the ships could move. It stuck to the hulls. It crawled up the rigging. It spread from ship to ship in cascading waves. Men jumped into the burning water, and that was no better than burning above it, because the wildfire burned on water too, and it did not go out. It simply burned and burned. A large part of Stannis' fleet was destroyed in the first few minutes. He landed troops along the bank and continued the assault. The city still might have fallen. Joffrey characteristically had himself recalled from the front lines at his mother's insistence, taking the defenders' morale with him. The Hound, Sandor Clegane, whose terror of fire had been the central trauma of his life since his older brother held his face in a brazier as a child, broke at the sight of the wildfire and refused further orders. With command collapsing and the defenders close to rout, Tyrion did something that his size and his history and his family's treatment of him had not exactly prepared him to do. He went out himself. He led a sortie through the tunnels beneath the city, striking at Stannis' forces from an unexpected direction, rallying his men with a speech that cut through the chaos with unusual directness. He was not fighting for the king, he told them. The king had gone inside. He was not fighting for honor or for gold, because most of them were never going to get any of either. He was fighting for this city, which was their city, which was full of their families, and which needed them right now. They followed him. He was nearly killed, a sword blow from Ser Mandon Moore, one of his own Kingsguard, opening a wound across his face that nearly took his nose and left him scarred for the rest of his life. He would later suspect, correctly, that the attack had been ordered by either Cersei or Joffrey, neither of whom wanted him to survive his moment of heroism. Tywin arrived at dusk with the Tyrell forces that Tyrion's diplomacy had secured. They hit Stannis from the rear and shattered his army completely. The city held. The Lannister position was saved. At the victory ceremony, Tywin was acclaimed the savior of the city. Tyrion received no honors. He was not mentioned. He was moved to a smaller room while he recovered from his wounds, stripped of his position as Hand, reduced once again to being simply the dwarf nobody wanted. This is the thing about the Lannisters that the gold and the power and the lions on the banners sometimes obscures. They were a family. And families, even the most powerful ones, sometimes have the sharpest edges turned inward. The cruelties Tywin inflicted on Tyrion were not the cold strategic violence he delivered to enemies. They were personal. They were intimate. They were the kind of wound that does not close. Section 10. The Red Wedding. Tywin's masterwork and its price. There is a way of thinking about the Red Wedding, the event that most people consider the most shocking single moment in the entire Game of Thrones story, that misses what makes it so genuinely terrible. Most discussions focus on its brutality, on the violation of sacred hospitality, on the deaths of beloved characters. All of that is real and worth feeling. But the thing that makes the Red Wedding so quintessentially a Lannister event is not the violence. It is the calculation that preceded it. Robb Stark had been beating the Lannister army in the field with a consistency that was deeply uncomfortable for Tywin. Not just winning battles, but winning them in ways that exposed Lannister military vulnerability, capturing Jaime, making the Western forces look slow and reactive, and always a half step behind a young commander who seemed to have instincts that transcended his years. If the war had continued on those terms, there was a real possibility that Robb would eventually march on Casterly Rock, and the question of whether even Casterly Rock could be defended against a sustained assault, led by someone as skilled as the young wolf, was not one Tywin wanted to test. But Robb had made a mistake. He had broken a marriage promise he had made to Lord Walder Frey of the Twins, a man whose strategically positioned river crossing made him enormously important to anyone who needed to move armies across the Riverlands, which Robb absolutely did. The Freys were not a glamorous house. Walder Frey was famously petty, famously grudging, famously obsessive about the perceived slights against his family's dignity that came with being a lord of middling prestige in a world that valued ancient blood above everything. When Robb married Talisa instead of a Frey daughter, he handed Walder Frey exactly the grievance he had always been looking for. Roose Bolton, Robb's own bannerman and one of the commanders of his army, was already thinking about what the changing shape of the war meant for his own position. The Boltons had ancient ambitions in the north that predated their fealty to the Starks by centuries. A Stark victory consolidated the old order. A Stark defeat offered opportunities. Tywin understood how to work with these raw materials. He did not invent the betrayal. What he did was guarantee it would succeed by providing something Bolton and Frey could not provide for themselves. Royal pardons and rich rewards on the other side of the act, the protection of the Iron Throne covering whatever they did. The arrangement was made quietly, in the way Tywin preferred all the arrangements that carried the highest stakes. Walder Frey would host a wedding between his daughter Roslyn and Edmure Tully, Robb's uncle, and invite Robb and his forces to attend. The laws of guest right were among the most ancient and sacred in Westerosi culture, the tradition that said a host who had given bread and salt to a guest could not harm them, and a guest could not harm their host. It was an almost religious prohibition, rooted in the earliest customs of the first men, and observed consistently across the continent for thousands of years. Lord Walder Frey was going to violate it anyway. The signal when it came was music. The Rains of Castamere, played softly by the musicians hired for the wedding feast. Catelyn Stark heard it first, recognized what it meant, and looked at Roose Bolton beside her with the cold certainty of someone who understands too late exactly what they are sitting in the middle of. She turned toward him. She looked at the sleeve of his shirt and saw the glint of chainmail underneath. He was already armored. He had known. What followed was a massacre. Robb Stark was killed, shot first with multiple crossbow bolts and then finished by Roose Bolton's own blade, a sword thrust to the heart, delivered with clinical precision and the words, "The Lannisters send their regards." His direwolf Grey Wind was killed separately, trapped in a kennel. Catelyn Stark died last, her throat cut after her hostage, a young Frey girl she had grabbed in desperation, was killed first. Most of the northern lords present were slaughtered in the Great Hall and the camp outside the Twins. The Northern Rebellion, which had looked so dangerous, which had come so close to genuinely threatening the Lannister position, ended that night in the dining hall of a provincial lord beside a river crossing. Tywin, when Tyrion confronted him about it, was direct in a way he rarely was. You want to know what he asked? He asked Tyrion to explain why killing 10,000 men in an honest battle was more noble than killing a dozen at dinner. The logic was consistent and the logic was monstrous, and both of those things were true simultaneously, which is a particularly Lannister kind of problem. But here is the other thing about the Red Wedding, the part that Tywin either could not see or chose not to see. The North remembered. It always remembered. That particular piece of Westeros, with its ancient traditions and its long winters and its collective memory that stretched back to the first men, was not going to absorb this and move on. The violation of guest right was not just a tactical crime, it was a cultural one. It made the Lannisters, in the eyes of the North, and eventually much of the realm, not just powerful enemies but fundamentally dishonest ones. Enemies whose word could not be trusted even when they offered you bread and salt. The debts that Lannister always paid. The promise that had sustained the family's reputation across generations. Something broke in it that night at the Twins, not immediately visible, not in any way that changed the outcome of the war, but something real. Tywin did not live to see the consequences unfold. In 300 AC, in the small hours of a morning at the Tower of the Hand, Tywin Lannister was shot twice with a crossbow while sitting on the privy. The bolts were fired by his son Tyrion, who had been on trial for a murder he had not committed, had been betrayed by his father's machinations throughout the proceedings, and had discovered along the way that his father had taken Shae, the woman Tyrion had loved, as his own bed partner. On his way out of the city through a secret passage arranged by Varys, Tyrion had stopped to find his father and say goodbye. The conversation had not gone well. When Tywin called Shae a whore and said something about Tyrion's first wife that constituted one of the final, unforgivable insults of a relationship built on them, Tyrion fired the first bolt. Tywin said the word that had never been forgiven. Tyrion fired the second. The greatest Lannister of the age died on a toilet, killed by the child he had spent a lifetime making feel worthless. It is the kind of ending that stories sometimes produce when they are being honest about what cruelty costs. Section 11. Cersei's Reign. The Fire in the Sept. After Tywin died, the thing that had held the family together by sheer force of personality and strategic genius was gone. What remained was a power structure built on his architecture, but now occupied by people who had never been able to operate within it without his guidance, and who were now free, catastrophically free, to make the decisions they had always wanted to make. Joffrey was already dead by the time Tywin died, poisoned at his own wedding feast by a combination of actors whose motivations would take months to unravel. The purple of his face at death, the particular color of his suffocation, gave the event its common name, the Purple Wedding. He had been cruel, erratic, sadistic in the specific way that comes when someone with great power has no internal check on their worst impulses, and has been raised by people who could not or would not provide one. His death was mourned by his mother, and almost no one else. Tommen, his younger brother, inherited the throne. Sweet-natured and gentle and utterly unsuited to the world he was being asked to navigate, Tommen was manipulated by everyone around him with varying degrees of awareness. His marriage to Margaery Tyrell, arranged as part of the Lannister-Tyrell alliance that had won the war, gave him a queen who genuinely cared for him in her own way, while also building her own power base within the city with great skill. Cersei watched this and felt her grip on her children, her last real instrument of power, slipping. Her response was characteristic. She escalated. The faith militant, that ancient religious order that had once challenged the Targaryens themselves, had been allowed to rearm by Cersei in a negotiation she arranged to cancel some of the crown's debts to the faith. She had viewed them as a weapon she could deploy against the Tyrells. She had not sufficiently considered what happened when a religious movement with genuine popular support and a sincere belief in divine authority was handed back its swords and pointed at the people Cersei wanted hurt. She was arrested, tried, found guilty of enough charges that the humiliation of her trial and her subsequent walk of atonement through the streets of King's Landing, naked, her head shaved, stones and worse thrown by the crowd, as a septa rang a bell behind her, crying shame, became one of the defining images of her reign. The woman who had been queen for 17 years, who had schemed and fought and sacrificed and survived, walked naked through her own city while the people who were supposed to fear her jeered. She endured it. That was the Lannister quality you had to respect, even through everything else. She endured it, and she remembered every face. Her response to the Faith militants' power, to the Tyrell's influence over her son, to the accumulated humiliations of the years since Tywin's death, was the one that should have been anticipated from a woman who had grown up in a family that had burned Castamir's tunnels filled with people, that had ordered cities sacked, and songs written about the silence that followed. She had the Great Sept of Baelor, the holiest building in all of Westeros, filled with wildfire. Not a little wildfire, enough wildfire to bring the building down and everything around it. The explosion, when it came, consumed the entire religious leadership of the city, most of the Tyrell family who had come to watch the trial, and a significant portion of the surrounding buildings. The green fire turned to dust what had taken generations to build. Margaery Tyrell died in it. The High Sparrow died in it. The entire religious and political infrastructure of the capital was simply gone. Tommen, standing at his window, watching the smoke rise from where the Sept of Baelor had been, took off his crown, set it down quietly, and walked out of the window. He was 15 years old. Cersei had won. Every enemy removed, every obstacle cleared, the throne empty and waiting. She walked to it and sat down, the first queen regnant in the history of the Seven Kingdoms to hold that title openly. She ruled for a time that was neither stable nor particularly effective, hampered by the paranoia and the isolation that had been building in her since Robert's death, by the loss of Jaime, who had finally, after decades of defending her, of doing every terrible thing she asked, and losing pieces of himself with each one, simply left. He rode north to help fight the dead in a conflict that Cersei had refused to participate in, choosing the political moment over the existential one, and when he rode away, he rode without looking back. The end came from the east. Daenerys Targaryen, who had crossed the sea with an army and dragons, things that had not been seen in Westeros for over a century, arrived at the gates of King's Landing after a war that had already stripped most of Cersei's allies away. The city burned, not as Cersei had burned the Sept, in a controlled surgical strike, but wholesale, the way fire burns when something ancient and enormous and barely controlled is given direction but not restraint. Cersei and Jaime died together in the cellars of the Red Keep as the ceiling came down, buried under the stones of Maegor's Holdfast, the deepest part of the castle that had survived so much over so many generations. The last two golden lions, end-stopped by the same rubble, the same stone, the same weight of a world that had run out of patience. Tyrion survived. Of course Tyrion survived. The man who had been most persistently underestimated by his family and his world, who had been called half-man and imp and worse, who had saved King's Landing and been given no credit, who had been tried for murder and convicted by the family that was supposed to be his, who had spent years in exile being more useful to Daenerys' cause than he was given credit for, lived to see the morning after. He was the last Lannister of any consequence. In the reshaping of the world that followed the destruction of King's Landing, when the lords and ladies of Westeros gathered to decide what came next and who should rule it, Tyrion was the one who shaped the outcome. He nominated Bran Stark as king. He became hand again to the new monarch, serving the realm in the role that suited him better than any other, the sharp-minded pragmatist standing beside the seat of power. The name Lannister would continue through him. Whether it would recover anything of its former weight was another question entirely, but the name existed, the cunning existed, the ability to find the angle, to work within impossible constraints, to survive things that should not be survivable. Those qualities, which had first manifested in a naked man covered in butter, squeezing through a crack in somebody else's fortress, were still there. Section 12, The Legacy, What the Golden Lions Left Behind. And so we arrive at the end of the story, or at least at the end of what can be clearly told. 6,000 years from Lan the Clever to Tyrion the Survivor, from a trickster in the dark to a diplomat in the council chamber of a broken city, the Lannisters had been, if nothing else, continuous. They had never been extinguished, not by Aegon's dragons, not by their own civil wars, not by the long, slow humiliation of Tytos' reign. They bent, but they did not break. And when they could not bend fast enough, they found another way through. What do you leave with from a story like this? What does the history of House Lannister mean, if meaning is something you want to extract from it? Part of it is simply the spectacle. 6,000 years is a very long time for a family to hold on to anything, let alone the position the Lannisters held. Their continuity alone is remarkable. Their gold is remarkable. The specific genius of their best moments, Lan's trickery, Tywin's cold strategic brilliance, Tyrion's combination of intelligence and humanity is genuinely impressive, but the story is also a very honest account of what power costs. The mines that produced Casterly Rock's wealth operated for thousands of years, extracting gold while requiring constant maintenance, constant vigilance, constant willingness to do what needed doing. The Lannister family was, in a sense, structured the same way. It produced power and influence and prestige, but the cost of maintaining those things was a constant willingness to be ruthless, to treat people as instruments, to do the calculation and follow it wherever it led, including to the drowning of 300 people in a flooded mine, including to a wedding hall full of blood, including to a sept filled with green fire. They always paid their debts. That was the saying, and it was true in a way that contained its own dark irony, because the Lannisters were also always running up new ones. Every act of ruthlessness that secured their position created a debt that would eventually come due in some form. Castamere purchased 20 years of fear, but also the particular hatred of houses that watched what happened to the Rains, and drew the obvious conclusions about what Lannister alliance was worth. The Red Wedding purchased the end of the Northern Rebellion, and created the conditions for the North's eventual collaboration with the force that burned King's Landing. The wildfire in the Sept purchased the throne and cost Cersei the last thing she had that was worth having. The debt always got paid. There is a quieter lesson in Tyrion, who represents something genuinely different within the family. He had all the Lannister intelligence without the Lannister callousness, or at least with enough counterweight to the callousness that it did not consume him entirely. He cared about individuals in ways that Tywin genuinely could not or would not. He suffered for it, constantly, humiliated and underestimated and nearly killed multiple times. But he also achieved things that pure strategic coldness could never have managed. Alliances built on trust that Tywin's version of power had no vocabulary for. The Lannisters at their best were the smartest people in any room they walked into. The Lannisters at their worst mistook that intelligence for a license to treat every human calculation as a strategic resource problem. Tyrion navigated that tension his whole life, and came out the other side with his name and his mind and a position in a new world's government. That seems, in the final accounting, like something worth having. The gold of Casterly Rock is still there, beneath the stone, in veins that the mining has not touched in years. The rock itself stands. The lion on the banner has faded somewhat, but it has not vanished. And somewhere in the bloodline that continues through survivors whose names we may not even know, some descendant of Lan the Clever is presumably looking at a fortress, studying a situation, looking for the hidden crack in the stone, and wondering if they are flexible enough, and patient enough, and clever enough to squeeze through it. They always were before, and that is where we rest tonight, at the end of the Golden Dynasty. At the end of 6,000 years of lions and debts and stone and fire, somewhere between the legendary beginning, a trickster whispering in the dark, and the complicated, morally tangled, genuinely extraordinary story that followed, there is a full life's worth of history to carry into sleep. You do not have to hold on to all of it. The story will be there when you wake up. It has been there for 6,000 years. Let your breathing slow. Let the weight of the day drift away. Let the sound of this voice become something like the voice of the wind on the western coast, the sound of the sunset sea moving against the rocks below Casterly Rock at night. Patient and ancient and entirely indifferent to the ambitions of the family living above it. They always paid their debts, and now they rest. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep journey through one of Westeros's most fascinating dynasties. If this story kept you company tonight, if it helped you drift somewhere quiet and dark and easy, then the single most meaningful thing you can do to keep more of these stories coming is to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Every one of those small actions goes directly into the possibility of more stories, more history, more of these long, slow journeys through the corners of a world that George R.R. Martin has made genuinely worth exploring. There are so many more stories waiting. Other great houses with roots just as ancient and histories just as layered. Other wars and tricksters and buildings full of fire, and people who paid terrible prices for the power they wanted. The well does not run dry. Until next time, sleep well. And may you always know the difference between wisdom and cleverness, and have enough of both to find the door when the rock seems impossible. Script end. Supplemental Section A. The Weight of Gold, Lannister Wealth in Deeper Context. It is worth pausing in the long flow of this story to consider something that tends to get reduced to a single phrase, and therefore loses its texture. The phrase is simple: the Lannisters are rich, and that is true. But richness of the kind the Lannisters possessed, the generational, institutional, geological richness of a family that had been sitting on the most productive gold mines in the known world for the better part of 6,000 years, is not the same thing as being comfortable or even very wealthy by normal standards. It is something categorically different that rewrites the rules of the society around it. Consider the specific architecture of Casterly Rock to understand what this kind of wealth actually looks like made physical. The fortress had begun, according to legend, as a ring fort built by Corlos, the founder of House Casterly, at the peak of the Great Rock. Over the following centuries, as the Casterly family extracted gold from the veins inside the stone, and those veins were worked out, the mine shafts left behind were converted into habitable space. Tunnels became corridors, chambers became rooms. The mines that had produced the family's wealth were gradually transformed into the bones of the palace itself, so that the rock was simultaneously a fortress, a residence, a mine, and a monument to the work that had built everything inside it. By the time the Lannisters had held the rock for a few thousand years, it had grown into something that defied simple description. The upper levels contained the great halls and noble apartments and the Golden Gallery, a famous room whose walls were hung with the accumulated art and trophies of millennia, whose gilded decorations caught every candle and torch and turned the whole space into something that felt warm, even in winter. The Lion's Mouth was the primary entrance, a great gateway defended by towers on either side, the kind of defensive architecture that Aegon's generals had apparently looked at and decided they were very glad their king had come to a diplomatic resolution. Below the great halls were more modest apartments and working spaces, then below those the older sections of the castle, the parts that had been corridors before anyone bothered to put proper floors and ceilings in them, and below those the active mines where work had continued for 1,000 years and more without exhausting what lay beneath. The rock went down, and the further down you went, the further back in time you were moving, until at the deepest levels you were in passages that first men's hands had cut with stone tools in an age before writing. All of this was the Lannister inheritance. Not just the gold that came out of those depths, but the structure itself. The accumulated centuries of labor and modification and habitation that had made the rock into something that could not be replicated anywhere else in the world, that was utterly specific to the history of one family's long occupation of one particular piece of the western coast. When Cersei said, to Margaery Tyrell and to others who needed reminding, that the Lannisters were not simply powerful and would never be merely powerful, that the full weight of their family pressed behind every negotiation and every threat they made, she was not being rhetorical. She was being geological. The rock was behind her. The gold was behind her. The 6,000 years were behind her. And she knew it with a certainty that did not require explaining to anyone who had spent even an afternoon thinking about what that accumulation actually meant. The debt metaphor runs through all of this, of course. A Lannister always pays his debts. It is possible to read this simply as a statement about financial reliability, and that reading is accurate as far as it goes. The Lannisters did pay their financial obligations consistently, and this consistency made them valuable as partners and dangerous as enemies, because you could predict their behavior. If you lent them money, it would come back. If you wronged them, something would come back for that too. But the saying contains a second meaning that is just as important. Debts of honor, of slight, of blood. The Rains of Castamere discovered this. Robb Stark discovered it. Anyone who looked at Tywin Lannister and thought they could afford to have him as an enemy and survive discovered it eventually. The payment of debts was not merely a financial virtue. It was a comprehensive promise about the nature of Lannister memory and Lannister purpose. They did not forget. They did not move on. They kept books on everything, and eventually, inevitably, they settled accounts. Supplemental Section B, Joanna Lannister. The woman Tywin became half a man without. There is a figure who appears relatively briefly in the explicit records of House Lannister history, but whose absence becomes one of the most important forces in the family's most famous generation. Her name was Joanna Lannister, and she was Tywin's wife, a cousin from the Lannisport branch of the family, a woman who had grown up alongside Tywin and who, by all accounts, was one of the very few people in the world who could make him laugh. Not at something, not at the expense of someone beneath him. Actually laugh, with ease and warmth, the way people laugh when they are genuinely happy rather than performing happiness for an audience. She was by any description a woman of formidable intelligence and notable political acuity of her own, who had served as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Rhaella at court before her marriage, and had navigated that particular environment, which was not a safe or forgiving one under Aerys's increasingly erratic reign, with considerable skill. She was also, if the stories about the early court under Aerys are to be believed, someone the Mad King himself had looked at with an attention that crossed the boundary of appropriate interest. There are accounts suggesting that Aerys had made comments about Joanna at the bedding ceremony of her wedding to Tywin that caused Tywin to never again bring her to court, never allow her near the king again, to manage that particular threat the way he managed everything, quietly and absolutely, and without giving the king any additional opportunities to remind him of the situation. She died in 273 AC, giving birth to Tyrion. Childbirth deaths were not uncommon in this era, and Tyrion's birth was reportedly an unusually difficult one. He emerged small and malformed, with legs that worked but barely, a dwarf in a family that prized physical beauty and size and the appearance of strength. And Joanna, who might have been the one person who could have looked at this third child and loved him with the straightforward warmth that children require, and that Tywin was apparently constitutionally incapable of providing, was gone before she could try. What this did to Tywin is something we can observe only through its effects, rather than any direct confession. Cersei, in the books, reflects that after her mother died, her father became colder and more severe, as if something that had been keeping the most extreme expressions of his nature in check had simply been removed. Jaime, in his own reflections, suggests that Joanna was the one person in the world whose opinion Tywin genuinely valued, the one voice he actually listened to, and that without her there was nothing left to moderate him. And Tyrion bore the guilt of it. Not his own guilt, necessarily, though he had absorbed enough of the family's message about his birth over the years to feel something in that direction. But he bore Cersei's guilt, which she externalized as blame and aimed directly at him. He bore Tywin's guilt, which the Lord of the Rock converted, as he converted everything, into a cold and implacable principle. Tyrion was the ruin of everything good, represented in flesh, and would not be granted a single thing that a Lannister was supposed to deserve. This is what made the Lannister family, in the generation that mattered most to the story of Game of Thrones, so structurally broken, despite its surface magnificence. At the very center of it was a wound that had never been treated, an absence that had shaped 3 children in 3 entirely different ways, all of them inadequate to the specific damage they had each sustained. Cersei, denied the mother who might have softened the world's message that her gender made her secondary, became brittle and paranoid. Jaime, denied the father's attention that a golden son deserved because his birth had been overshadowed by his twin circumstances, sought validation through physical excellence and his sister's love. And Tyrion, carrying the guilt of Joanna's death like a stone in his chest from childhood, became the most emotionally intelligent Lannister of his generation, perhaps because he was given no choice but to develop that intelligence as a survival mechanism. Joanna's death was not a political event. It had no military dimension, it changed no borders and won no wars. But it removed the one structural element that might have held the family together through the storms that were coming, and its absence is woven into every disaster that followed, like a thread you can trace if you know what you are looking for. Supplemental Section C. Tyrion in full. The half-man's complete story of all the Lannisters, Tyrion rewards the longest look. He is the one who contains, within the arc of his life, the fullest version of what the house was and what it could have been. He is the contradiction at the heart of the Golden Dynasty, the person who should have been nothing and became the one through whom the family endured. He was born a dwarf and grew up aware of it in every interaction he had with anyone. His family's wealth gave him access to the best education available in Westeros, and he used it voraciously, reading everything, acquiring knowledge the way his family acquired gold. Not because anyone told him he should, but because knowledge was the one resource no one could confiscate. If the world was going to insist that his body made him less than other men, he was going to ensure his mind made that argument very difficult to sustain. He was also, from relatively early, aware of where the family's power actually came from, which gave him a practical education in political economy that many men with much more conventional advantages never received. He understood that the Lannister name was valuable, partly because it was backed by real military strength, and partly because it was backed by the perception of strength, and that both had to be maintained deliberately. He understood that his father's ruthlessness was not gratuitous but functional, that Tywin had looked at a situation where the family name was being eroded and had made a calculation about the price of restoring it. Tyrion could do the calculation himself. He just reached different conclusions about which prices were acceptable. As a young man, he traveled. He went to the Wall and looked at it with the particular attention of someone who has spent their whole life being underestimated, and came away with a genuine respect for the Night's Watch that most people of his class never bothered to develop. He met a girl on his way back, or rather he thought he did. She was a commoner named Tysha, and he fell in love with her with the desperate sincerity of someone who had not been given much opportunity to receive uncomplicated affection. They married. Briefly, he was happy. Jaime arranged for Tywin to intervene. Tywin, who saw this marriage as everything wrong with his youngest son, compressed into one act, had Tysha brought to a room where he forced Tyrion to watch what happened to her, and then told him the truth. She had been a prostitute that Jaime had hired to make Tyrion feel better about himself. She had never loved him. The whole thing had been a kindness that had the texture of a lie. Years later, in the dungeon after his trial, Jaime told Tyrion the true truth. Tysha had not been a prostitute. She had been exactly what she seemed, a girl who loved him, a commoner who had married him genuinely, and whom Tywin had destroyed out of principle. The lie about her being a whore had been Tywin's addition, designed to ensure that Tyrion could never look back on that episode of his life with anything but self-contempt. This revelation, delivered in a dungeon on the night Tyrion was facing potential execution for a murder he had not committed, broke something that was already cracked and under enormous pressure. He killed Shae, whom he found in his father's bed. He killed Tywin, who called him a name that had specifically been chosen to hurt. And then he was put on a ship and sailed across the narrow sea into exile, carrying the name Lannister like a brand on a slave, and had to figure out what he was going to do with the rest of his life. What he did was remarkable, though it took time to become visible. He advised Daenerys Targaryen during her campaigns to retake the Seven Kingdoms, serving as her hand and bringing to that role the same combination of political intelligence and strategic clarity that had made him effective in King's Landing, deployed now in service of something he actually believed in rather than something he had been assigned to manage. He made mistakes. He was often wrong about Daenerys in ways that cost lives. He struggled with the experience of having chosen to believe in someone and then watched her choices diverge from what he had believed her to be. When King's Landing burned, when Daenerys turned the dragon on the city itself and the people in it, Tyrion walked through what remained and made the choice that defined his later life. He resigned his hand. He walked toward a rest rather than away from it. He chose, in that ruined city, to be the one who said no rather than the one who found a way to rationalize yes. The Lannister who always paid his debts paid the hardest one in that moment. The debt to his own conscience, which he had been running from since before his sister and father had given him reason to. At the Council of Lords that determined who would rule the Shattered Realm, Tyrion proposed that the choice not be made by sword or birth or hereditary claim, but by something closer to genuine selection. The great lords of Westeros choosing among themselves who should hold the throne. He nominated Bran Stark for reasons that were partly practical and partly something less articulate, an instinct that a man who could not truly want power for its own sake was exactly the kind of person who might use power well. The council accepted it. Bran was chosen. Tyrion was named Hand again because the new king had no practical political experience, and Tyrion, whatever else you said about him, had more practical political experience than almost anyone living. He ended as he began. The imp, the half-man, the Lannister who was never supposed to amount to anything. Working quietly, managing the mechanics of governance, paying attention to detail because the details were where everything actually happened, finding the angle that other people had missed, making himself useful to a succession of rulers who needed someone like him even when they could not quite bring themselves to respect him the way he deserved. The name Lannister, which had meant gold and lions and power and the particular cold brilliance of Tywin, ended with someone who embodied something different, not less intelligent, but differently deployed, not less capable of ruthlessness, but more capable of choosing not to be ruthless, even when the calculation said he could. Not less Lannister, but more willing to find the part of being Lannister that did not require destruction as its proof of existence. Supplemental Section D. The Cersei Paradox. Power that devoured its wielder, Cersei Lannister, is one of the most complicated figures in the entire story, and she deserves a section of her own rather than being summarized in the rush of events that surrounded her. She was, by any objective measure, one of the most politically skilled people of her generation. She was also one of the most self-defeating. Both of these things were true simultaneously, and the tension between them drove the entire shape of her story. She grew up aware, at an uncomfortable early age, that the world she was born into had decided what she was worth before she demonstrated what she was capable of. She was Tywin Lannister's daughter. She was golden-haired and beautiful and smart, perhaps as smart as her father in certain respects. And in a different kind of family or a different kind of world, she might have been the heir. The one groomed for leadership. The one sent to learn from the best minds the realm had access to. Instead, she was married off to Robert Baratheon in a political arrangement that prioritized the alliance her body could create over any use her mind might serve. The Maggie the Frog story is worth dwelling on for a moment. When Cersei was a young girl, she and a friend slipped away to consult a woods witch, an old woman living in a forest near Casterly Rock, who had a reputation for telling real fortunes rather than comforting ones. Maggie the Frog told Cersei 3 things that shaped her entire adult life. She told her she would indeed become queen. She told her the king would have 20 children and she would have 3, and that she would see all 3 die before her. And she told her that she would be cast down and destroyed by the younger and more beautiful queen. Cersei heard these things at an age when they were too big to fully understand and too specific to dismiss, and she spent the following decades living inside them. The prophecy did not change what she chose to do. It simply made everything she chose feel more desperate, more urgent, more necessary. Every alliance she formed, every enemy she neutralized, every manipulation she constructed was partly an attempt to outrun what Maggie had told her. She could not outrun it. No one outfunds a prophecy in these stories, but she spent 30 years moving at full speed trying. What the prophecy cannot account for, and what makes Cersei genuinely tragic rather than simply villainous, is the specific quality of her love for her children. It was the one entirely unstrategic thing about her. She loved Joffrey despite his cruelty, loved Myrcella with a gentleness she showed almost no one else, loved Tommen with a fierce protectiveness that eventually contributed to the circumstances of his death, when she cleared the board of his enemies so completely that he had nothing left to live for when the board itself collapsed. Her love for her children was real, and it was powerful, and it was absolutely central to who she was. And it was also the lever that every intelligent enemy she faced knew they could pull when they needed to move her. She was constrained by her gender in ways that she resented with a depth and consistency that comes through in everything she did. Her father never trained her for rule because daughters were not trained for rule. Her husband did not consult her because wives were not consulted on governance. The court she moved through for 17 years of queenship was full of men who saw her as decoration or impediment or resource and almost never as peer. She adapted to this by learning to work inside the constraints, finding the levers that women in her position could pull without it being noticed. And then, when Tywin died and the constraints were suddenly gone, discovering that she had no practice operating outside them. This is the Cersei paradox. She spent her entire life mastering a form of power that depended on operating indirectly, on working through others, on being the person behind the person rather than the person visible at the front. And then she found herself at the front, on the throne, with no one left between her and the decisions, and discovered that the skills she had spent decades perfecting were not quite the right tools for that position. She was formidable. She was brilliant. She was also, in the specific context of ruling a kingdom through one of the most dangerous periods in its history, not quite the right shape for the job. The wildfire solution was pure Cersei in its elegance and its excess. It solved the immediate problem absolutely, It created consequences that spiraled beyond any possibility of management. It was her father's approach, stripped of her father's restraint, and the difference between Tywin's calculated ruthlessness and Cersei's emergency ruthlessness was exactly the difference between someone who had been thinking about the second and third order effects for months and someone who was responding to immediate threat with the most powerful tool available. She ruled on the throne until the world ended around her, and she died with Jaime, which is perhaps the most consistent thing about her entire life. Whatever else changed, whatever alliances fractured, and children died, and political structures collapsed, she always came back to Jaime in the end. The twin who had been with her before they were born, the one relationship that existed outside calculation, the thing that was hers in a way that nothing else had ever quite been. That she died with him, that the last of the Golden Lions went out together in the dark, under a mountain of stone, has the shape of something complete, even in its catastrophe. They had begun together, those two, sharing a womb and a childhood and a golden world of privilege that hid its costs. They ended together, in the place their family had built, in the final darkness. Supplemental Section E. The World After. What Westerners made of the Lannister legacy history, in the world of Westeros as in our own, is not simply what happened. It is also what the people who survived decided to make of what happened, which stories they chose to carry forward and which ones they allowed to fade, which lessons they drew from the record. The legacy of House Lannister in the years immediately following the events of Game of Thrones would have been complicated and contested in ways that the history of most dynasties eventually becomes. The gold of Casterly Rock was real, and it remained, still in the ground, still producing in the mines that had not been worked to exhaustion, despite the decades when the family's attention had been directed elsewhere. Someone would eventually claim those mines and that wealth, and whoever did would become instantly relevant in the post-war political landscape. The rock itself, which the Unsullied had captured and then essentially abandoned as strategically empty without its defenders, would need a lord. The Westerlands needed governance. The infrastructure of a region that had been one of the most economically important in Westeros would need someone capable of managing it. Tyrion, as hand to the new king, would have had views on this. He would probably have understood better than most that the Lannister legacy in the Westerlands was not simply a family story, but an economic and political reality that required careful management. The people who had served under Lannister governance for generations did not simply cease to need governance when the specific Lannisters running it died or fled. They needed new arrangements, new understanding of what the rules were going to be now. The songs would continue. The Reigns of Castamere would continue to be played, though its meaning would shift as the events it commemorated receded into history. It would become, over time, less of a threat and more of a dirge, less a warning about what you risked by crossing the lions, and more a melancholy acknowledgement that even the lions eventually fell. The song that Tywin had used as a weapon, that had chilled rooms and silenced conversations for decades, would become something else in its afterlife. Music always does this. It outlasts the specific political moment that produced it and becomes available for new interpretations. The Lannister debt would be remembered differently by different people. In the Westerlands, where the family had been lords and masters and patrons for 6,000 years, the memory would be predominantly one of order and wealth, the way people remember things that were sometimes harsh but consistently present. In the North, where the Red Wedding still lived in living memory at the end of the story, the memory would be sharper and darker for considerably longer, the kind of thing that gets told to children as a cautionary example, and that shapes how subsequent generations of Northerners read Lannister offers of alliance. In King's Landing itself, in the streets where the common people had lived under various Lannister-backed regimes for decades, the memory would be more ambivalent than any of the official accounts would capture. The Lannisters had kept the city functioning through the siege of Stannis and the various political crises of the post-Robert era. Tyrion had saved the city from burning the first time. Cersei had burned it differently the second time, though she had not meant for the fire to go as far as it did. The common people of King's Landing had been simultaneously protected and exploited, and occasionally massacred by the people in the red cloaks with the lion banners, and their feelings about it would not resolve easily into a single narrative. This is what real legacies look like when you get close enough to see all of them. Not heroic achievements or simple villainies, but something more textured and more human. A series of choices made under pressure by people who were neither monsters nor paragons, but something considerably more ordinary, ambitious, frightened, capable, limited, sometimes brilliant, sometimes catastrophically wrong, and always, always convinced that what they were doing was necessary. A Lannister always pays his debts. The last payment was made in fire and falling stone, and the ledger came as close to zero as it ever would. What came next was someone else's story to write. Closing section. The long night's accounting. We have come a long way tonight. I want to take a moment before we drift fully into silence to acknowledge the distance we have covered, because distance in a story like this one is worth feeling. We started in legend, in the morning of the world, with a golden-haired man covered in butter, squeezing through a crack in someone else's fortress. We end in the ruins of the greatest city in Westeros, with two golden-haired people buried under stone. Between those two images, 6,000 years elapsed, and in those years more happened than we have been able to touch in a single night's telling. There were other Lannisters we did not get to linger with. Lord Jason Lannister, who died in the Dance of the Dragons, his horse killed beneath him by a crossbow bolt at the Battle of the Red Fork, dying in the same river valley that his house had fought over for centuries. Sir Tyland, his twin, who bore torture without betraying his family's treasury and survived to serve as Hand of the King under Aegon III. Lord Gerald the Great, who raided the Iron Islands. The unnamed generations between Lan and Lorien, who held the Rock through seasons whose names we have lost. They were all Lannisters. They were all part of this. There were moments of genuine grace in this story, not many, but they existed. Lan's cleverness was genuinely admirable, even when applied to theft. Tywin's ability to rebuild a family from the humiliation of his father's era was a kind of triumph that deserved recognition, even from people who found his methods appalling. Jaime's choice to kill Aerys, rather than let the city burn, was an act of conscience that cost him everything, and was right. Tyrion's refusal to let the trial result stand without fighting it was a refusal of injustice that came at enormous personal cost. Even Cersei's love for her children, however much it twisted into something destructive, was love. This is the gift that George R. R. Martin gave us in this family. People who were complicated enough to be worth thinking about long after the story ends. Not simple villains whose badness provided a necessary contrast to the heroes. Not simple heroes. People who were full of contradictions and history and specific damage, who made choices that were sometimes magnificent and sometimes monstrous, and often both at once, who were shaped by forces they could not fully see and whose effects they could not fully predict. That is what good history feels like, whether it is the history of a fictional dynasty or a real one. Not a clear moral lesson, but a series of moments in which human beings faced conditions they did not choose, and made choices whose consequences echoed further than anyone anticipated. The Lions of Casterly Rock, the Golden Dynasty, the family that always paid its debts. Now rest. The story is complete. The night is quiet around you, and somewhere in the dark, in a mountain on a western cliff above an ancient sea, a vein of gold that has been there since before memory runs still through the rock, untouched, waiting for someone with enough patience and enough cleverness to find the way in. There is always a way in, if you look long enough. Good night. Supplemental section for The Dance of the Lions. Jaime's long journey home. There is one more thread in the Lannister story that deserves to be followed carefully, because it is perhaps the most human one, and the one that demonstrates most clearly what happens when a person who has been defined entirely by a single role discovers that the role was always hollow. Jaime Lannister spent the first 30-something years of his adult life being the Kingslayer. Not the term he chose for himself, not the identity he would have selected if he had been given a selection, but the one the world assigned and refused to revise. Cersei's brother, Cersei's lover, the man who killed the king he swore to protect. Good with a sword, irrelevant otherwise. He knew what he was capable of beyond the blade. He had demonstrated it multiple times when given the chance. The management of the siege at River Run, conducted after he had returned from captivity missing his sword hand, and without the physical gift that had defined him for 30 years, showed a different kind of intelligence, the kind that solves problems through conversation and understanding and creative interpretation of what a negotiation can contain. He found a way to end a standoff that would otherwise have required an expensive and destructive siege without a drawn sword, through the particular gift of knowing exactly how much honesty to deploy at exactly the right moment. This is the Jaime who existed alongside the Kingslayer all along, the one who watched Aerys do terrible things for years and found ways to survive the watching that he later described to Brienne as going away inside, retreating to some internal space where the worst of what he witnessed could not reach him. It was a self-protective mechanism that worked well enough in the specific crisis it was designed for, and very poorly for everything else, because you cannot go away inside indefinitely without losing track of the part of yourself that is capable of being present. Brienne of Tarth forced him back into presence in a way that was entirely unplanned and entirely necessary. She was his prisoner, and he was her captive, and then they were both prisoners together. And in the baths at Harrenhal, where he told her the truth about why he killed Aerys, he stopped going away inside for the first time in years. He talked. He explained. He said the things he had never said to anyone, and discovered that saying them did not destroy him, that the truth he had carried for 20 years did not kill him to share. This was the beginning of a real change in him, halting and inconsistent, visible mainly in retrospect rather than in any single dramatic moment. He started making choices that were not Cersei's choices, and not his father's choices, and not the Kingslayer's choices, but his own. He went north to fight the dead when Cersei told him the Lannister forces would stay south. He left her when she revealed, in that cold interview after the negotiations at King's Landing, that she had never intended to honor the truce and send forces to the north. He left because he had spent 30 years making every choice she needed him to make, and this was one he could not make. He came back to her at the end, when the city was burning and she was alone in the place she had tried to defend, and he came back not because he had reversed the decision, but because she was Cersei and he was Jaime, and some bonds are older than decisions. He died trying to get her out, both of them failing, the stones settling over them in the dark. It was not a redemption in the sense that redemption stories usually offer, not a triumphant end with the hero vindicated and the villain punished, and the audience satisfied that the moral ledger has been squared. It was messier than that, as real things tend to be. He had been better than the Kingslayer label allowed for. He had also been worse than his growing conscience was comfortable with. He died in the middle, neither redeemed nor condemned, which is roughly where most interesting people die. What he had given the world by the end, regardless of how his story ended, was a demonstration that the Lannister gold could produce something other than what it usually produced. That within the machinery of that great cold dynasty, there was room for a person who wanted something beyond power, who was capable of genuine loyalty to something other than family interest, who could be changed by the people he encountered, rather than simply using them and moving on. The Kingslayer, the Oathkeeper. Both names belonged to him, and neither one contained the whole of him. The Lannister who wore a white cloak and broke the vow it represented, and in so doing saved 500,000 lives and was never forgiven for it. That is as good a summary of the Lannister condition as any other. The act that should have made you a hero becomes the one that follows you as a mark of shame, and the debt that gets paid is the one you spend your life trying to forget you incurred. Rest now. The Golden House has told its story. The coins are quiet in the vault. The lions have gone to ground. A final note for listeners, before the silence fully settles. The world George R.R. Martin built rewards exactly this kind of slow, unhurried attention. There is always more to find in it. There are always threads that lead somewhere unexpected, connections between moments centuries apart that light up when you give them the time to show themselves. The history of House Lannister connects to the history of House Targaryen and House Stark, and the Iron Islands and the Free Cities and every other part of this extraordinary imagined world. All of it woven together in ways that make each individual story feel more complete when you understand what sits beside it. If you want to be here when those stories are told, when the next dynasty gets its long, quiet examination, when the next 6,000 years of ambition and gold and cleverness and catastrophic human error get laid out slowly for you to drift through, then the subscribe button is the simplest way to make that happen. It is there. It does not ask much of you. And it means that the next night you are looking for somewhere to go as the world goes quiet. There will be something waiting. Thank you for the privilege of your attention tonight. Go gently into the dark. The Lannisters, for all their lions and their gold, and their long history of paying every debt in full could not hold back the morning. Neither can we. And neither should we, because the morning always brings something new. And sometimes, if you have rested well enough, you are ready for it. Good night.